Kevin's good morning. Glad to have you all here. As Kevin said, my name is Dr. Dina. I've been a raw foodist since 1987. And like a lot of you, I have had some personal experience with different types of fasts and cleanses and raw diets and all that type of thing that we all do, trying to make our way through the maze of raw food information to try to figure out what works best for us. But in addition to that, I spent 4 years of my life, from 1997 to 2001, at a fasting center a couple hours south of here. And this was actually a water fasting center where people would come and just drink water for a period of time, and I would get to observe what types of things would happen. And I consistently saw people recover from diabetes, high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, and autoimmune disease, and any other type of inflammatory condition, routinely and consistently. And oftentimes these people were told that, you know, this is just the way it is, your dad and your grandpa had this, you've got this now, you're going to be on this medication for the rest of your life, and, you know, there's really nothing we can do, we can help manage this. Again, I would see those things, people recover from that stuff routinely and consistently, so it was really great experience. Also in the past, I worked at Hippocrates Health Institute in West Palm Beach, Florida, where they're big advocates of green juices, so I'd see people go through some juicing programs. So I'm here today to share some of my experience with you and make some sense out of fasting and cleansing. So first of all, let's talk about what a fast is. Now, the word fast means to abstain. So when you're fasting, you're abstaining. And the definition of fasting I subscribe to, which I didn't make up, it's the definition of the International Association of Hygienic Physicians, doctors who actually specialize in fasting. And they define fasting as the abstinence of all substances except pure water in an environment of complete rest. So that may not sound exactly like the type of fast that some of you may have been on, or some different types of programs that are referred to as fasts. So if fasting means to abstain, let's just say someone is doing a juice fast. Well, technically it isn't really a fast. Juice is food. It's just fruits and vegetables generally without the fiber. And I used to really think that the people who made that point were fanatical and ridiculous and say, look, people, we all know what a juice fast is, so just, you know, calm down and whatnot. Although over the years, I've come across some different types of fasts. There's a blended food fast or another type of food fast. And in fact, I can remember one patient a number of years ago, this is when I was at the fasting center. They also had an outpatient office with medical practice, chiropractic practice, and psychology practice. So I would see chiropractic patients in the outpatient office. And this one patient came in, and as we were going through her health history, I could see on the form that she checked off she had fasted before. So I inquired, of course, what type of fast did you do? Was it a juice fast? Was it a water fast? And she said, none of those. I said, well, what exactly was it? She said, I food fasted. And you know, after that, I thought, all right, now I see their point before. Maybe it is good to have a definition of what's going on. So what I will do is I'm going to refer to a fast as water only in an environment of complete rest. And other things, you could call it a juice cleanse, juice diet, a blended smoothie cleanse, whatever the case may be. There's the master cleanse. There's all sorts of things out there. And here is the primary premise of all of them. Let's just start out with some bullet points here. Our body has the ability to heal itself. And I know that's not surprising for all of you to hear. I've been doing some remodeling in my house lately, and I've cut up my arms here. But I'm going to say that within a week or two, you won't see these cuts here, because the body has the ability to heal itself. Now, we all know that we get energy from food, but we can all think of, say, a typical holiday meal, whether it's a traditional holiday meal with turkey and stuffing and gravy, or even maybe a raw holiday meal where we're having nut loaves and cheesecake and that type of thing. Now, do most people sit down to a holiday meal and say, you know, I've read about the research showing that maximum longevity can come from minimizing your calories. And I want to live a long life, so I'm just going to take a little bit of everything and leave the table a little bit hungry. Is that what most people do at holiday get-togethers? They say, oh man, load this up, load that up, load everything up. And we know that we get energy from food. In fact, during the time I was supervising people water fasting, several days after water fasting, this is typically a sprinting pace for a water faster. So you don't have a real lot of energy when you are not consuming food. So we know we get energy from food. But after that big holiday meal, how do most of us feel? Super energized? Ready to go out and run a marathon and go exercise? What usually happens is you go in the other room and you turn on the TV and you watch other people exercise. And you doze off during the commercials until some more coffee comes and you stimulate yourself with caffeine to keep you going. Now, during that time, when you are stuffed and you're tired, how many people have ever gone out for an intense hike or gone swimming right after a big meal? Has anyone ever done that? We've all probably experienced that a little bit. And how does that work? It's Dr. Phil question. How's that working for you? How does that work for you? Does it work well? Does your body say, hey, I've got so much energy from all this food, I can go do all my activities right now? Usually you get a cramp. And the idea is that because you've consumed a lot of food, your body says, we're going to direct our resources to get the energy and the nutrient and the calorie value from this food so we can perform our activities. But while it's doing that, you don't have a lot of energy left over for other activities, such as exercise, where you've got to supply a lot of blood flow to your large skeletal muscles and make everything work. So you get a cramp, and digestion takes precedence. And in almost every single circumstance, digestion will take precedence over everything else. Your body doesn't say, hey, let's put digestion on hold so you can finish your hike or you can go swimming. It says, no, we're going to put your activity on hold. It's going to be painful to keep doing this activity so we can deal with that food. Now, if you were trying to heal from something, let's say you broke your leg or you just had a few scratches on your arms like I do now, do you think in that time after a large meal, when your body's directing its resources toward dealing with that meal, do we think that would be the time that our body's healing capacity is maximized? Would anyone make that argument? That's when healing is maximized? Or would we maybe think that a little later, once the body has dealt with that meal, then we have some energy left over? We start to actually be able to swim or be able to hike. We feel a little more alert and awake. That's the time actually when our body can heal itself more fully because those resources are now available for the body to do that. Very, very simple concept, but so frequently overlooked. Now, within nutrition, I like to break it down to two basic parts. Number one, we need to get all the nutrients and all the energy that we need from the food we eat. And number two, we need to make sure that what we're putting into our system doesn't leave waste materials that interfere with our body's optimal functioning. That's, okay, I'm blinded now. I know you're out there, though. Okay, let me get my post-blinded train of thought back. So, yeah, number two is making sure that your body is free from waste products that interfere with its optimal functioning. And of those two, I will put more weight toward the latter, toward the second. I will say that keeping your body free of waste is even more important than supplying your body with all the nutrients. Even though that's critical, if I had to choose, I would say the second is even more critical. So let's just say you've been eating a typical American diet, and you decide that you would like to eat more healthfully, and you come to a place like the Vibrant Living Expo, and you hear the speakers, and they talk about raw food, and they talk about that food, when it hasn't been cooked, contains enzymes. And those enzymes actually give your body a head start in the digestive process. And they talk about things like raw fruits and vegetables are full of water and fiber that take up lots of room. So they fill up your stomach without as many calories. Therefore, you don't eat as much, and you've got more energy left over. And things that were troubling you before maybe start to clear up, and you have more energy, and you start to feel better, and that's a great thing. Now, we can take that a bit further and say, consume only juices for a period of time. And what's happening there? Do fresh vegetable juices require an enormous amount of digestive energy like the holiday meal? Or are they pretty light? So that's pretty great. So basically you've freed up your body's resources when you're consuming just juices to allow the body to heal itself. And that's really the ultimate extreme endpoint of that would be fasting just with water in an environment of complete rest. So does that make sense? All right, just want to make sure we're really clear on the basic concept. Just to illustrate it a little bit more, how many people have ever been in the shower and someone flushes the toilet and you get a blast, say, of hot water because the cold water goes away because there's only so much cold water to go around, and if some of it goes toward flushing the toilet, not enough is left in the shower and it gets a little bit hot. So we all know these basic concepts. So in any case, let's just say, okay, so I've had people say to me, well, what about the master cleanse? That's, for example, drinking lemon juice and maple syrup and cayenne pepper. I've had great results with that. Well, I did a juice fast. Well, I did a juice feast. Well, I did a green smoothie cleanse. All of these things are beneficial because you are using less energy than you were in your previous diet. And therefore, your body has the ability to cleanse, heal, and repair itself more than it did before, and that's a good thing. That's really the basic premise of it. So let's just say you wanted to juice fast. Let's talk about that a little bit. Some people say you should just drink a few glasses of juice per day. Other people, more at the other end of the spectrum, the juice feasting end of the spectrum, say you should drink several quarts of juice per day. Now, I know when I do a juice fast, and I usually do one each spring, because when I was young, starting at about 5 or 6 years old, I developed hay fever and allergies, and I went to the doctor, and they put all these scratches in my back and added the things, and the few things really itched like crazy, and those were the things that I was allergic to. And then they told me I was allergic to trees, grass, and weeds. And I thought, hey, no problem, I can avoid those, I'm fine. So I started getting allergy shots. And for example, I couldn't play Little League one year because they'd always cut the lawn on Saturday morning before they'd come out, and then I was just a mess. My eyes would be running, and I couldn't see, and I'd be sneezing, and my nose would be running. And until the time I was 20 years old, I suffered with that every spring, secondarily in the fall, and really there were some days I would miss school or work because of it, and it was a real difficult thing. Maybe 40 or 50 days a year I would have those type of allergy symptoms. Some worse, some not so bad. So in any case, when I was 20 years old, I had been reading about fasting and was already into raw food for a little bit at that point, and I did a 14-day water fast. Now, I did it in the way that I would absolutely not recommend. I did it while I was living in my college dorm. And everyone is asking me, dude, man, I hear you're on some kind of hunger strike, what's going on? And they didn't quite understand what was going on. But what happened was amazing. That was during the winter. And when spring came that year, I was absolutely astounded that I had 1 day of allergy symptoms instead of 30 or 40 or so. So it was just amazing. And it really made me realize my body must have had the opportunity to cleanse some things out. So for about 10 years after that, I barely suffered any allergy symptoms until I moved to Northern California. Seems to be a lot of allergy difficulty here in the spring. So for a few years, I suffered a bit. But for the last 6 or 7 years or so, even though I couldn't stop my life to do a water fast, I did a juice fast. So I'm finally getting back to, usually each spring, I do a juice fast. And that actually helps make allergy season a lot easier and a lot smoother. And I get through with a couple of days that are a little rough, but I'm not blown away for weeks at a time where I sometimes used to be. So what I typically do is do fruit juices during the day, but not straight fruit juices. This is just there's many ways to do it. I'm just giving you my personal experience. When I was at Hippocrates Health Institute, they used to put they used to put the rind in with the watermelon juice. So they would just cut up watermelon, rind included, and juice it. And I realized that was actually rather delicious. And what the rind does is it allows the simple carbohydrates to be diluted a bit. It adds some minerals and adds some water, so it's not quite so sweet. Because fiber helps regulate blood sugar. And when you juice something, you remove the fiber, especially when there's a lot of simple carbohydrates. In the case of fruit juices, those when they turn into glucose or blood sugar, that can make your blood sugar level rise pretty quickly. So in any case, having the rind in there is very helpful for stabilizing that. And also, I put some celery in there. So I typically, throughout the course of the day, consume about 2 quarts of watermelon celery juice. And I would drink it depending on my needs and activities. If I had the morning off from seeing chiropractic patients, maybe I'd just drink a quart. If I had a full afternoon of patients, I would maybe drink 2 quarts because I'd have to go around and work on people and adjust their spines, and there's a little bit of physical activity there. Now, in the evening, I would typically drink green juices. Now, greens are so incredibly nutritious. However, vegetables are not as calorie dense as fruit. So I would have had to consume a lot more vegetable juices during the day to get the same amount of calories to provide the energy for my activities. So that's why I would do fruit juices in the day and vegetable juices in the evening. And I know back when I worked at Hippocrates, that many of you know they're really into wheatgrass juice. And it was really cool. I lived about 7 miles away, so I typically ride my bike in, and I would take a dip in their ozonated pool, and then I'd go and I worked in the greenhouse and in the juice bar, so I had access to that stuff. So I'd have a whole big tray of wheatgrass, and I'd slice up the whole thing and juice up about 6 or 8 ounces of it and drink it down, and I would shake, and all the hair on my arms and all over my body would stand straight up. Unfortunately, after a little while doing that, I got a little burnt out on wheatgrass, and even to this day, if I go to Whole Foods near the juice bar and smell it, I get the shakes. So what I typically do now is I'll take something very green, like chard or kale. I'll take a whole head of it, and I'll juice that up along with a cucumber or 2, some celery, maybe a half a head of celery, and a few carrots. And that, depending on what quantities you use, that makes about a quart or 2. And so in the evening, I would drink green juices. Less calorie dense, but that's okay. I didn't need to do as much activity in the evening. And that seems to work really well. And I would do consume about a gallon of juice per day. So that would be more in the juice feasting model. And for me, that worked pretty well. And I think all of you, depending on what you're doing, can use those basic principles depending on your needs and follow that. So I'd always feel better after, and I'm going to hold on until the end of questions. I'm going to save plenty of time, but you'll be first. So that seems to work well for me. It seems to work well for a lot of people, and it's a great thing to do. Now, let's just say you are suffering from something like diabetes, high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, autoimmune diseases, those things I mentioned in the beginning that respond consistently and predictably to water fasting. And you don't want to wait 3 or 4 months with a good diet and exercise program for things to correct themselves. You want to do it as quickly as possible. Well, if that's the case, it may be appropriate for you to go to a facility where you can fast only on water, where you can abstain from all substances except pure water in an environment of complete rest. Now, if you do that, you will be supervised. And it's extremely important that if you're going to undertake a water fast of more than a day or so, that you go to a place where you're properly supervised. Now, there's several reasons for that. Number one is, first of all, you can actually be in an environment where you can rest. So that's extremely important. If you think that you're still going to drive the kids to soccer practice and do all your normal activities and work a little bit, it usually isn't going to work out so well. Time and time again, I would see patients come into the fasting center with the boxes of paperwork that they were going to catch up on, and by the end of the fast, they hadn't touched it. Because again, This is a sprinting pace when you're fasting, so they would just rest a lot. So the other part is you have people around you who are supporting you. So if you're trying to do activities and you have your neighbors coming over asking you why you're on a hunger strike and you're getting too skinny and you're going to die and all that type of thing, then that's not going to be a good environment to fast. So that's number one. And number two, there are occasions where things come up during a fast, during the cleansing process, because that's pretty extreme cleansing. Stored toxins that are stored in your fat cells and other types of cells have the ability to come out of where they were stored, and now they're in your bloodstream, which means your liver and your kidneys are working overtime processing those toxins to allow your body to get rid of them. Now, in general, that's good. However, you don't want to go, you have to be very careful with that, and I'll give you a case history. Now, before I say that, though, there are some fasting practitioners who criticize the use of lab work during a fast. Now, at the fasting center where I was in practice, we would make sure that before the person started their fast, we would have some recent lab work. If they had something taken within a month before, that was fine. Or if not, we would take some lab work and check their liver and kidney function, electrolytes, basic chemistry panel to see what's going on, to have that as a baseline. And every 7 days that they were still consuming only water, we would have the lab people come in and draw some blood to see what was going on, to make sure everything was good and everyone was having a safe experience. And the majority of the time, everything was fine. There's one case history I can remember of a guy with diabetes who weighed, I'm not exaggerating, about 400 pounds. He had pretty out of control type 2 or adult onset diabetes. And when you get into the advanced levels of diabetes, when you've had it for a while, one of the consequences of that is impaired circulation. So the bottom of his leg from his knee down was totally discolored due to poor circulation. So he started fasting, and what was really nice is over time, the discoloration at the bottom of his legs started to clear up. Started down a little below the knee and kept working down. He was making really excellent progress. Now, on day 14, when he was still fasting, they took the second fasting blood work. And day 17, we got the results back. I think there was a weekend in between there. And what we saw on the lab work was something called creatinine was elevated. And some of you, I see their heads nodding. BUN, which stands for blood urea nitrogen, and creatinine are the two basic indicators of kidney function that clinicians can look at on a standard blood chemistry panel. Now, we knew from taking a careful history of this patient that he had been involved in some heavy-duty drug use, and getting over some addictions was part of also why he was coming to fast. Now, some of his friends, colleagues, cohorts in drug use who had done similar things to this patient had actually died of kidney failure from drug overdose. So it was pretty clear to us by putting 2 and 2 together that this person with this history of drug use during the fast, we saw their creatinine level increase, which was an indicator that their kidneys were stressed because their body was freeing itself of these stored toxins and it was in the bloodstream now. Now, this individual wasn't experiencing any symptoms whatsoever. They felt fine, they looked fine, but by seeing an elevated creatinine on the lab work, we could head things off at the pass before they had any type of crisis where they'd have to go on dialysis or bring them to the emergency room or anything like that. So we stopped their fast and put this gentleman on juices starting on day 17. So to me, that's a great example of if he had just done this on his own, he may have ended up in a crisis, and by being supervised, he was able to avoid that. He ended up staying another month or so. And all the staff really liked him because he was helping them take the compost out, and he was excited that the driveway was on a little bit of a slope, and he could walk up and down the driveway, whereas when he first got there, he could barely get up the driveway without huffing and puffing. It was only about 20 yards long and a little bit of a slope. So he really had an excellent outcome and an excellent recovery, whereas he might not have if he wasn't properly supervised. So that's my cautionary take on if you're going to do water, you want to be supervised. Really, really critical, especially if you've had any kind of history of drug use or anything else. You can't just wean yourself off of all medications right away. A lot of times there are protocols for how you can wean things off. And usually medical doctors at fasting centers do just the opposite of what most medical doctors do. Most medical doctors say, hey, your blood pressure's high, well, let's put you on medication and let's put you on all this stuff. They spend their time taking people off of it, but it needs to be done very carefully. I can remember one instance where one patient, the medical doctor didn't wean them off their beta blockers, which is a blood pressure medication, quite properly. They actually weaned off a little bit too quickly, and there was a neighbor had a fire. It was in the winter, and a little bit of smoke was coming into this patient's room. They were having a difficult time breathing. Their blood pressure went up. It's called rebound hypertension from weaning off the medications a little too quickly. And I had just recently gotten to the center, just recently graduated from chiropractic school, and this guy's having trouble breathing, and I'm thinking back to my advanced first responder course that I took in the 8th quarter, and okay, check the airway and do all that stuff. We ended up having to call 911, and the guy was fine, but nevertheless, you need to be very careful, and you want to make sure everyone's going to have a good outcome. So the last thing I'll discuss before I open up to questions, so we have plenty of time for questions, is a lot of people have asked, well, isn't fasting dangerous? Because during fasting, you go into a state of ketosis. And people know that on the low carbohydrate diets that really aren't healthy for us, that a lot of people have complications from, you're in a state of ketosis, and that's not good. Other times people have heard about people who have diabetes, and either from a lack of insulin or from insulin not doing its job properly, they go into ketosis and they can actually go into a diabetic coma, and that becomes a life-threatening situation. So people hear about those things and then hear, well, with a water fast you go into ketosis. Isn't that life-threatening? And the good news is the answer is no, and let me explain why. Ketones are a byproduct of fat metabolism. So after a couple of days of fasting, when your body's used up all of its carbohydrate reserves, which is the primary source of fuel for our cells, your body has no choice but to start using fat for energy. And because you're burning primarily fat for energy, you're making a lot of ketones, and you're going to end up with ketones in your urine and in your bloodstream. So you're now in a state of ketosis. Now, on a low-carbohydrate diet, the same thing happens because you're so low on carbohydrates in your diet that you're also burning primarily fat for energy, and you go into a state of ketosis. Now, the huge distinction here is that when people have diabetes and end up in a diabetic coma, that's not just ketosis. It's called ketoacidosis. And here's the distinction. When somebody has diabetes, and I'm going to talk in a lot more detail about this tomorrow at 4 o'clock in my talk on insulin and blood sugar and carbohydrates. When someone has diabetes, and I'm going to talk about type 2 or adult onset diabetes here, which is 90 to 95% of people with diabetes out there fall into that category. What it means is it means their cells, muscle cells, liver cells, different cells in the body are resistant to the hormone insulin. And it's also known as, aptly named, insulin resistance. And the significance of that is insulin's job, its first job, it has many jobs, but one of its primary jobs is to take glucose or blood sugar that is in our bloodstream and escort it from the blood into the cells. So when it can't do its job properly, or if you just don't have enough insulin, and insulin can't do its job of escorting glucose from the blood into the cells, there's two things that can happen in the extreme. Number one, because the cells are not getting glucose or blood sugar, in other words, they're deficient in carbohydrates, the cells have no choice but to use burned fat for energy. So just like any other time you're burning mostly fat for energy, you end up with those ketone bodies and you're in ketosis. But in the case of diabetes here, if that glucose can't get from the blood into your cells, it's going to remain in the bloodstream. And over time, the blood sugar level is going to go up and up and up and up. Now, at normal levels, that's fine. Even at abnormally high levels, that's fine. But when we get into extremely high levels, so for example, you want your fasting glucose to be between about 70 and 110. After a meal, it can be in the mid-hundreds and then go back down. Sometimes in people with diabetes, the fasting glucose level gets to 200 or 300 or 500. That's not so good for a variety of reasons. But when it gets really high, 900, 1,000, 1,100, really crazy high levels, what happens then is glucose is slightly acidic. So again, at normal levels in the bloodstream, there's plenty of alkaline buffers, everything's working fine. But when you get those extreme levels, the blood actually starts to move toward the acid end of the spectrum. Now, it doesn't get quite there. Just brief thing on acid-alkaline balance. 7 is neutral. 1 is extremely acid. 14 is extremely alkaline. Our bloodstream always needs to stay right at 7.4. There's not much room for error there. If it goes up to 7.8, you get weird muscle spasms called tetany, where your muscles tighten up and you're not in control of it. If you get down to about 7.1, you go into a coma. So when you hear the term diabetic coma, it means that there's such extremely high glucose levels in the blood that the acidity from that high level of glucose brings the bloodstream down to about 7.1 and you go into a coma. Now the acidosis part, it's extremely rare, by the way, that anyone's blood ever actually gets acid. People say, oh, I'm acid. No, you're not. It's incredibly rare that you've ever been acid and lived to tell about it. You get to 7.1, you're still a little alkaline. You're in a coma. If you get to neutral at 7, you're in a lot more trouble. Sometimes there's been cases with extreme athletes. Maybe they went to 6.95 and took a long time to recover. But in any case, so at 7.1, they go into a coma because their blood is so acidic. That is the part that is life-threatening. Does that make sense? Now, and it just so happens that because all of that glucose is in the blood and it's not in the cells, your cells are burning fat for energy because they have no other choice, and you get ketosis as a result, but the ketosis itself isn't the problem. It's the acidosis. So does that make sense? Ketoacidosis versus what I'll call benign ketosis. If throughout human history, human beings weren't equipped to fast, I mean, don't you think there were times in human history when the crops failed, when there were no animals around, when spring came late? And throughout the course of human history, people have fasted. It's referenced in the Bible and other places. So we're quite well equipped to be able to fast, and it's not life-threatening. In fact, many times it can actually save your life. So bottom line, no matter what, I don't know what that says, it's blue. 10 minutes, that's great. So no matter how you slice it, from eating a little bit less food than you did before, a little bit lighter, a little bit more fresh fruits and vegetables, all the way to water fasting, anywhere you are along that spectrum, you're doing the most good for your body by freeing up your body's resources to cleanse and heal itself. So let me open up to questions. This gentleman, then you're next, and then I'm just going to go around the room for until they kick us out. Yes, sir.
All right. Actually, I have a couple of questions, but they're all wrapped in. So you talked about cleansing in the springtime is what you do, or fasting in the springtime. Is that the only time throughout the year? Because there's lots of people who say you should do it quarterly or as the seasons change. Is there benefit to doing it multiple times a year versus once a year? And also, my second question is there an average time that you spend doing your fast? 1 week, 2 weeks, or is it more of a how you feel and how it's progressing?
Okay, so this gentleman's question was, in my case, I said I fast in the spring, and his question was, should you fast other times of the year, and if so, then how long should those be, basically? So in my particular case, I always do it in the spring because I know if I don't, even if my diet's been clean up to that point, which it usually is, I'm fairly consistent, not perfect though, I know I'm going to have some trouble in the spring. So that's huge incentive. And by the way, most people don't fast just for fun. It's usually they have some kind of life-threatening illness that fasting seems easier then, so they'll take the easier road. If I get the opportunity another time or two per year, that's great. I know at the beginning of this year I did about 2 weeks on juices in the beginning of January, and it was just a great way to start out the new year. Now, in general, the amount that someone may need to cleanse is largely dependent upon how they live their life when they're not fasting. So if they are eating a typical American diet, the need for cleansing is greater, and they should do that. They should do some type of cleanse several times per year, just to give their body a break, free things up. The nice thing about that is every time they do that, the tendency is to make some healthier changes that'll stick with people. So over time, as they make healthier and healthier changes, not only does fasting help cleanse them out, but it's a tool for helping to maintain healthier changes, which then means the need for fasting is not as great. So it really very much depends. And myself personally, those fasts in the spring are juice fasts are somewhere between 7 to 14 days, just depending on what's going on. Okay, and yes, ma'am, in the green sweater right here.
Is there a role for, and what is the role of colon hydrotherapy when you fast?
Okay, so is there a role for colon hydrotherapy when you're fasting? For juice fasts and different blended smoothie cleanses and those type of things, if someone's really feels as though their intestines are really clogged up and whatnot, I think colon hydrotherapy or enemas and psyllium seed can be beneficial. However, during a water fast, that's a whole different ballgame. So, this is a sprinting pace. I know times when water fasting of just flipping over in bed and pulling the sheets on me is rather tiring. So if, let's say, you do an enema if you're several days into a water fast, the water goes in, and then the smooth muscle lining of your large intestine has to contract, which means nerve energy is used, electrolytes are used, and even though that doesn't sound like a huge expenditure of energy to us in the normal eating state, it's a big energy drain for somebody water fasting. And I have seen a few people do enemas who just insisted doing enemas during a water fast, and then they were pretty much wiped out for the rest of the day. So I think those things can be very useful with the exception of water fasting as a way of helping clear some things out so the body can heal itself. I do caution, though, against their regular use and becoming dependent on any of those things as a crutch. So use them short-term as a useful agent to hopefully not need them as much in the future, sort of like fasting itself. Okay, and yes, ma'am, in the back.
Thank you. Can you please explain what happens when an individual does a long fast? I did a long juice fast or juice feast, and when I began eating very simple raw foods, sprouts, salads, and soups, I suffered from extreme edema from my ankles up to about my knees. And can you explain to me what is occurring and what I can do to support my body?
Okay, so did everyone hear that? Your voice projects well. Okay. Now, were you consuming when you started eating sprouts, was there any salt, any brag, any namashoyu, anything at all added?
No.
There was none at all?
No.
Wow, so I am not sure exactly. I think we need to talk more and find out the details of what you were doing. But I will say this. Now, I know after someone water fasts, they are extremely susceptible to edema from any type of added salt at all. And the thing is, sodium is one of the important electrolytes, that a charged particle that runs back and forth across our cell membranes to conduct electrical activity in muscle cells and nerve cells. If you don't have those, things don't work. So your kidneys get extremely good during a water fast, or to a less degree during a juice feast, at reabsorbing sodium. So for a while, your kidneys are totally in the reabsorb every bit of sodium they can get mode. And if you start eating things that are higher in salt, after that, you're reabsorbing all that sodium, and then your body needs to retain fluid in order to dilute it. Over time, though, things, quote, normalize a little bit, and your kidney retools, so to speak, to be able to excrete more sodium. So that may or may not directly be related to your case, but anyway, that's a good general principle. Okay, and this gentleman in the black coat.
Can you do a liver flush and then start fasting?
You could. So the question was, can you do a liver flush and start fasting? And by liver flush, you mean the typical gallbladder flush type thing? You certainly could. And there would be some debate there as to whether that was getting your liver a little cleaner to start with so it could do a better job during your fast. Others might argue just start the fast and spare your body drinking all that oil, which some people don't like. But you could debate that either way, but I think that would actually be fine. And part of what I think is one of the biggest benefits of those liver cleanses is that if you just forget the therapeutic part and the softening the gallstones and the oil part, you're usually just doing apple juice or something like that for a period of time. So to me, that's the biggest benefit. So if you did that and skipped the oil, you might still get a huge amount of benefit. But anyway, and that's an excellent transition into a fast. I know typically if you just go from normal eating to water, boy, around dinner time that first day, it's awfully rough. I noticed even with juicing with a lot of people, they drink more juices at the beginning of the juice fast and tend to go lighter as time goes on, and then transitioning into water is a lot easier. So to that degree, I think it would be an excellent way to transition into a fast. And yes, ma'am, over here?
I want to find out what you part of intermittent fasting on a regular basis instead of doing a long fast. I mean, meals, or especially if I fly a lot, and I don't usually eat when I fly, and for like at least 7 to 10 hours, and I'll make up when I arrive, and I never have jet lag.
Okay. So the question was, how about intermittent fasting compared to one long fast? And I guess the basic answer is it depends. So you said you fly a lot, you don't eat when you fly, you don't get jet lag, you feel better. In your case, that sounds totally appropriate, and that's great. You're not out of glycogen reserves after 17 or 18 hours, which means you're not truly in the actual fasting state. You probably haven't gone into ketosis at that point. But by skipping a few meals, you've saved your body all that work, and it sounds like it helps you recover from jet lag better and that type of thing. So that's perfectly appropriate. Now let's just say you had some type of uterine issue or prostate issue for the men. Those type of things tend to respond only at the end of a rather lengthy period of fasting. Seems like the body seems to work on the immediate things first, lowering your cholesterol, lowering your blood pressure, lowering your glucose, whereas reproductive things tend to happen later. I guess maybe the body figures, let's get you healthy first before you can reproduce and take care of something else. So if you had, say, uterine fibroids, the periodic fasting like that might not be useful in that circumstance. But for your circumstance, it sounds perfectly good.
If you were to go on a long fast, you will burn fat, but what about muscle wasting?
Okay, so what happens, and this is a great question, I'll try to be very brief here. So there's 3 basic phases of fasting for water. Oh, the question is, how about burning muscle? I'm sorry, when you're fasting. So phase 1, not unique to fasting. You're using the fuel from your previous meal. Phase 2 is you're out of that fuel and your body starts drawing upon its glycogen reserves, which is stored up glucose in the liver and the skeletal muscles. Once you're out of that, then your body starts burning fat for energy and you go into ketosis. However, especially at those beginning phases, you still do need some glucose, especially the brain. So the way the body gets glucose is it goes through a process called gluconeogenesis, creating glucose from a new source. And one of the primary sources to create new glucose are amino acids. And they get the amino acids from muscle cells. So for the first few days, you are drawing upon some of your amino acids in order to create glucose. So at the first few days of a fast, you're using a good amount of that. In the early 1900s, they looked at that and it made a linear extrapolation and said human beings can't fast more than 7 days. Then they're dead. I've seen people fast up to 40 days. And the reason for that is because as time goes on, your body gets more and more efficient at using fat for energy instead of glucose. So by not needing as much glucose, you spare your protein reserves. But even at the end of a long fast, people, as long as they get a little exercise, they build their muscle right back up afterwards. Sometimes, though, people, if they want to lose weight, so 5 minutes, if they want to lose weight as quickly as possible, they'll go do activity and walk during a water fast. And we caution them not to do that. And I explained that, okay, you'll lose a couple more pounds, while you're actually fasting, but because you're fasting and your body still needs some glucose, when you do physical activity and engage your large skeletal muscles like your leg muscles and butt muscles in activity, you're creating a demand for glucose, and the source of that glucose is amino acids, which means you're actually using up some of your muscle reserves. So after the fast, they'll have a slower metabolism because all else being equal, the more lean tissue you have, the faster your metabolism is, even if you're just sitting around on the couch. So really the best thing about fasting and weight loss is that it helps people maintain a healthier program afterwards. So yes, you can lose some muscle a little bit during a fast, but that's the rest part of it. Rest, rest, rest. You conserve your lean tissue, and you have a healthier experience. Okay, and yes, sir?
Okay, you're doing a fast, your fat cells are releasing a bunch of toxins.
That is correct.
Some people suffer damage from that. What should you do to help your body eliminate those toxins, and what do you think of coffee enemas?
Okay, so the question was, your fat cells are releasing toxins during a fast. What do you do about that? Can it be harmful? And what about coffee enemas? Well, I know the Gerson program has had excellent success, including coffee enemas and fresh juices and liver juice included. And they seem to have really good success. I haven't actually tried one. I'm a little hesitant. I know I have an ex-girlfriend who did a coffee enema one time, and she was up all night, and she resolved all her family issues and, saw God and all this stuff. And the next day she slept the whole day. So it can certainly act as a stimulant no matter which end it goes into. It certainly is true, like I mentioned before, that your bloodstream is more full of toxins during a fast, and your liver and your kidneys are working overtime. It's debatable. Some would say that, sure, coffee enema helps stimulate the liver to get that stuff out of there. Others would argue that you're sort of intervening and thwarting your body's own intelligence by artificially stimulating the liver, and you'd be better off letting your liver do its thing on its own. I wouldn't recommend a coffee enema during a water fast for the reasons I mentioned before, and just additionally, it's just very stimulating. But in other circumstances, it may be beneficial. But you do want to not fast, not go too extreme all at once. And then one of the reasons I recommend people get supervised when they do a water fast.
So what else should you do to help your body eliminate the toxins?
You rest as much as possible, and your liver and your kidneys handle getting rid of the toxins. I know, we can make it more complicated, but really that's the bottom line. Okay, do we have time for one more question?
One more.
Okay, one more. Yes, ma'am, you've been waiting patiently. And by the way, if I don't get to your questions, just come on out afterwards, and I'll do my best. Don't know everything, but I'll do my best to answer the questions you have. So yes, ma'am.
Have you seen anybody that's actually suffering from type 1 diabetes, also Hashimoto's thyroiditis, autoimmune conditions?
Yes. Okay, so the question was, have I seen people recover from type 1 diabetes or Hashimoto's thyroiditis? So I know that, as I mentioned, autoimmune conditions respond typically very well to fasting. Hashimoto's thyroiditis, as you mentioned, is an autoimmune condition. I haven't seen a patient with that specifically, but my guess would be they would likely have favorable results. Now, type 1 diabetes gets rather complicated. Within the professionals who undergo fasting, type 1 diabetes is considered a black and white contraindication. It can get very, very complicated to fast a type 1 diabetic. I've seen that once, and I feel like I've got a pretty good handle on hormone regulation and endocrinology and blood sugar regulation, and I just didn't understand what was going on. And so we only fasted this type 1 diabetic for one day. Now, with most people with type 1 diabetes, their cells in their pancreas have gotten damaged, so they don't make insulin. So they have to start injecting insulin. Now, just like everybody else, as they go throughout the course of their lives, their cells become more and more resistant to insulin, and they have to continually up the dose. So usually an adult type 1 diabetic is taking a lot more insulin than they did, say, as a teenager. So the good news with type 1 diabetes from healthy eating is they can reduce their insulin use dramatically, but they're still going to need a little bit baseline because their body isn't making any. So they can make good improvements. Okay, thank you very much, everybody.